Gregory Hallows, and this is Preserve Halloween Podcast. So, it's been a while. I haven't recorded a podcast in quite some time, and it's not that I haven't had ideas or haven't had the want to do it. It's mostly just time and a lot of other stuff going on. So, enough about that. I've done a lot of fun stuff since the last podcast. I went to Midsummer Scream. I've been preparing for the next year of the Halloween Preservation Society memberships. I am working on the guest list for the Preserve Halloween Fest later this year in Texas. But, I'm always researching and always stockpiling ideas for podcasts and things to share with everyone. And I've been sitting on this idea for quite some time, but it works out that it's almost roughly the 10-year anniversary since this kind of became a bigger deal. Back in 2012, a guy named John Cimino, or Cimino, I don't know how you say his last name. It's Cimino. He is a comic book and cartoon and memorabilia expert. He's a collector like a lot of us. And he wrote a story about a costume that he had recently acquired, and it kind of changed the course of one of the most popular characters in comic book history, pretty much. But before I get to that, let me explain the reason why this story is so interesting to me. Yes, I do love Halloween. I love everything about it. But my biggest, probably, fandom is comic books and Spider-Man in particular. I've always been a huge Spider-Man fan. I was born in the mid-'70s, so by the time I was a kid, Spider-Man was already huge. He came out in the 60s, of course, in the Amazing Fantasy issue number 15, which I would love to own a copy of, but I've seen that cover my entire life with him swinging, holding the robber under his arm. That came out in 62 in August, which is awesome because I was born in August, so I feel some sort of connection to Spider-Man my whole life. One of the first superheroes that had problems. He was just a kid. So a lot of things about Spider-Man I related to. So anyway, Spider-Man is and was one of my favorite things. I still love everything about Spider-Man. I still, can't wait to see the new products. I cried during the latest Spider-Man movie when all three of the Spider-Men were on screen. I am not ashamed to admit that. That was one of the best scenes of any movie I had ever seen because it was a true fan moment to be able to see that after, years of putting up with. I love the 60s Spider-Man cartoon. I loved the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, the television show in the 70s where, Spider-Man was basically just a reporter. Every now and then they would show his powers, but it was really just him pulling himself up the side of a building with a rope. So wasn't very impressive until Tobey Maguire and Sam Raimi changed everything with their version of Spider-Man, where it's the first time you actually can see him swinging like we all would imagine it would look like. And, it's gone from there. Now, Tom Holland I think is probably the best version of Spider-Man there is. I really like Andrew Garfield, but uh, Toby Toby Maguire was good too. I mean, he's always going to be one of the first. I really loved the costume of the Spider-Man during the television show, the brief time it was on. I really liked the concept of the Japanese Spider-Man. It's pretty nuts, but I still thought it was cool. Anyway, I am going off course like I always do. So anyway, let me bring this back to the guy John Cimino and his I guess kind of just accidentally discovered a piece of history that was forgotten. Like I said, Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, Spider-Man, their first appearance was Amazing Fantasy number 15 in August of 1962. And wasn't exactly a overnight success. It did take a few years for, I think, Spider-Man to become somewhat popular. And let's not forget, during this time, Ben Cooper, who we all know and love, Ben Cooper was probably, you know, in their heyday. They did start in the 30s, but it wasn't until the late 40s that Ben Cooper Inc. was one of the largest Halloween manufacturers of costumes in the U.S. It took some time, but, their name was synonymous at that point with Halloween and costumes. So this is where the story gets interesting. John purchased a set of costumes from a barn, I believe. Just a guy, he had some stuff in his barn. He tried to get rid of it, thought nothing of it. But he started researching and, as we all as collectors do, researched and realized this costume was made in the early 50s. Ben Cooper had been distributing a Spider-Man costume beginning in 1954, which is almost 10 years before Marvel's version of Spider-Man made his debut. So there's where the mystery begins to present itself. Who created the character of Spider-Man? Marvel Comics headquarters and Ben Cooper Inc., both in New York. You can throw in, besides Ditko and Stan Lee, Jack Kirby's also involved with this story, Joe Simon. Some believe Jack Kirby was a freelance artist for Ben Cooper in the early 50s. That's never ever going to be proven unless someone from that family admits it, because Ben Cooper, the company itself, was horrible with records, and most of it, if not all of the records, were burned down when their factory burned in the, I think the 80s. Anyway, there's no records proving Jack Kirby worked for Ben Cooper, but this is where the paths cross. Jack Kirby had concept art for a character he called Spider-Man back in the early 50s. And that was, there was a character well before Marvel Comics Spider-Man called the Fly and the Silver Spider, and I think there was even a Spider-Man that existed before Marvel. But what it was is, the Jack Kirby involvement, I don't think is ever going to be something that we can prove. But you can prove the fact that Ben Cooper was producing a Spider-Man costume in 1954 because there was a catalog that John uncovered, Ben Cooper Spotlight Halloween catalog, because, back then there was no internet. There was no, you put out catalogs to advertise your products to companies that you hoped would buy those products. So there is a catalog from 1954, and Ben Cooper's Spider-Man costume is on the cover. And it looks like, the body of it is a typical Ben Cooper costume. It's, the very thin, cheap fabric that we've all loved. It's a webbed design costume with a big spider on the chest, where kind of in the middle, but off to the side. But the mask looks like a paper bag with a spider webbing on it. And at the very top across your forehead, it says Spider-Man. So that costume was sold from 1954 until 1957. So still well before Spider-Man's creation from Marvel. Now, what happened after that? The first Spider-Man official Marvel Comics Ben Cooper costume, which has been proven to be the first Marvel memorabilia. At first, it was believed that the Marvel Marching Society, their fan, I guess it's membership, that was considered for many people to be the first Marvel, product, but it wasn't. It was the 63 Ben Cooper costume that was officially licensed well before Spider-Man became popular. So a lot of people, including John himself, believes that Ben Cooper, the executives, kind of maybe figured, hey, this costume looks a little bit like what we created, so maybe let's just strike a deal with Marvel. Let's use that as leverage to make them give us the license to the character, because who knows, it might become as big as Superman, which, Spider-Man did become huge. And the Spider-Man costume that they put out in 1963, with very little changes, sold well into the late 80s. It was probably one of the only superhero costumes that they continued to market and produce for 20 years. Because if it's selling, why not? So, John, thankfully, I'm very excited that he did all this work, because a lot of people would have just decided, hey, you know what, who knows, we'll never figure this out, let's just leave it. Well, no, John wrote Steve Ditko directly and included some images and clippings from what he had found from, the catalog from Ben Cooper. And, of course, there was some other he wanted to include as much proof that he could, but, there's not really, I've never even seen this 1954 catalog other than in pictures, so kudos to him for finding all this stuff. It's amazing to me. Well, in 2014, at the end of the year in November, John wrote a letter to Steve and asked him, just basically straight up, did the Ben Cooper Spider-Man design have any influence on what became Marvel's Spider-Man? And Ditko wrote him back in January of the following year, just a couple months later, actually a little over a month, so it was a very quick response. He wrote him back and he said, "Dear John, the burden of proof is on the person who makes the assertion, claim, or charge. some clipping, etc., are not rational proof of anything but some clippings, etc. So very well written non-answer. Um, the best thing that, Steve Ditko has a reputation of being a recluse. But his up until the day he died, whenever he would respond to any fan that wrote him, it was a handwritten letter, and you got Steve Ditko's autograph, which is amazing. I wish that I would have wrote to him at some point, but I always felt like I didn't want to bother him. I kind of just wanted to leave him alone. He chose to live his life the way he did, so uh, I just felt, I don't know, it felt weird. But John also approached Stan Lee and asked him, what he thought the connection was between Ben Cooper's costume and Marvel's Spider-Man design. And Stan, kind of the same answer. He said, I really didn't know what was going on outside of my office. I was concentrating on, coming up with ideas for the company, which is probably true back at that time. That was early Marvel, and, that's when everything was created. All the characters that we know now who have been staples for Marvel for decades, that's when it all came together. So I can't imagine how much, just ideas were coming out of those guys at that time. But no one's left from Ben Cooper. The company itself doesn't even exist. Ruby's owns it since the early 90s. They bought it out after Ben Cooper went through their second bankruptcy. So Ruby's inherited the history and, products from Ben Cooper, but did not inherit any kind of written history, or there's no one to talk to. Martin Goodman's not around anymore, who was at the time was he probably would have had the answer. No one from Ben Cooper except their heirs are alive anymore. Stan Lee has passed away. Steve Ditko's passed away. Jack Kirby's passed away. So anyone that could have definitively answer this question is gone. So this is one of those stories to me that is even more fascinating because we're never going to know. The costume that Ben Cooper originally came up with did change somewhat over the course of the few years it was put out. The mask changed from the weird looking bag over your head webbing design to a straight up spider's web with a spider in the middle that said Spider-Man on top. And they said that they changed it so that kids could see better, but I don't really know. And then they also put out another design that had, I guess it's supposed to be a spider, but it looks like a giant bumblebee to me. I guess, yeah, the legs give it away as a spider, but it's got a fly trapped in its web on the front of the suit, and the original design was, just webbing all over it, but this one, they kind of just used that design on the torso. The mask is really cool. It looks a lot like the original Spider-Man designs that they would use for advertising that had, not exactly a circle, but a web design in a circle with the Spider-Man, those classic eyes. And then it said Spider-Man across the top. So it's very similar to that. But 1963, just, a year after, not even a year after Spider-Man made his debut for Marvel, Ben Cooper was making the new Spider-Man, officially licensed Marvel Spider-Man costume, which I think from what I've read, there's only literally a handful of those that exist. By handful, I mean like five, no more than five, maybe. Um, I've never seen one of the 50s era Spider-Man costumes, the yellow one. Just pictures. Uh, I think at this point, 10 years after the story has come out, that it would be almost impossible to find one of those suits for any legitimate price. I do own one of the 1965 versions of the Spider-Man costume, which is probably as close as I'm going to get to owning, the first year. I may stumble upon one at some point, but 63 and 64. 64 is really just the 63 box, like overstock, because when it first came out, um, that costume didn't sell very well. The public didn't care. They didn't know what Spider-Man was, because uh, he was only on his seventh issue, I think. The Amazing Spider-Man number 7 cover date was December, but it hit newsstands in September like comics do. And that was, at the time Ben Cooper was releasing costumes for Halloween, and that's the first, Marvel Spider-Man costume. And so in 64, it was, you know, I don't even know if they redid any. I think they just sold the overstock that didn't sell the year before. And it sold a little bit better, but it wasn't until 65 where Spider-Man had, kind of made an impact on the public and had a fan base. They put out the costume again, and this time it was released in 3 different new box designs, and it sold much better. So I'm trying to track down what those 3 boxes look like, because I want to make sure, I kind of want to know which one I have. Like, do I have one of the more popular ones, or do I have a harder to find one from 65? And to tie into the whole superhero thing, what I didn't realize, and I forgot because I had read this a long time ago, but the word superhero, Ben Cooper actually licensed it. He trademarked it way back in the 60s. DC, Marvel, neither one of them opposed it, which I find insane. I don't know if they still own the copyright or if Ruby's assumed it. I'd need to look up the patent office and the trademark, because you can just look it up. I think I could find out if it's even trademarked anymore. But for $35, Ben Cooper trademarked the word superhero. And I mean, I'm still amazed the stories I read about how smart that company was and how ahead of the game they were as far as marketing and acquiring rights to, because in 1966, just a few years after Spider-Man, that's when the Batman show on TV with Adam West and Burt Ward became huge. And, superheroes are on our television during prime time. And so that helped with the popularity of all superheroes. I mean, it didn't last very long, the Batman thing, I think maybe a year or so. But Batman, they had the first costume for him, for Ben Cooper, in 64. And they also had already had Superman and Wonder Woman. And those did well. It was always weird for me to see the advertisements from like Woolworths or any of the department stores back then that had, Spider-Man next to Superman, next to Wonder Woman, next to Captain America. Because, like, we all know that those don't go together. But most of the superheroes kind of disappeared from the lineup in the late 60s, early 70s. But Spider-Man was consistent. Uh, I always liked the Hulk costume Ben Cooper did. I've posted a picture of me dressed as the Hulk a few times. The Iron Man mask they made was really neat. The Thor one was weird because it was Thor, but for some reason they wrote Thor on his forehead. I guess just in case you didn't know who Thor was, he had to have it written on his head. Um, I need to look and see. I think they also made a Doctor Strange costume and some other ones. I know in the 80s they made these things. I think they were called jigglers. They were basically like this really weird, like that really soft plastic. It feels like slime pretty much, but they made characters of that, of Spider-Man, the Red Skull for some reason, Doctor Strange, the Thing. Those were all Marvel jigglers. So Ben Cooper kept the license for Marvel for quite some time. And then, of course, in the 70s and 80s, kind of things started going downhill. Ben Cooper, they had to, they lost a lot of their licenses in the late 80s to Collegeville, mostly, I think, and some of the other brands that were still around. But they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1988, and they, sadly, in 1989, their facility in Georgia burned down, and they said they lost $2 to $3 million in inventory, and their insurance company would not cover the loss. So that was a huge hit for the company. They came out of it in early 1989. They paid off all their creditors in full, so kudos to them. They didn't take the easy way out. They actually paid off every debt they had. And then, sadly, though, they had to file bankruptcy again in 1991, and that was the end of the company. Ruby's bought them out in 1992, and it hasn't been the same. I thought Ben Cooper would be a bigger deal as far as putting out stuff, and I was really happy to see that Ruby's is actually putting out some superhero things this year. I saw some images from, I think, San Diego Comic-Con that showed that they're going to put out some of the costumes again. John mentions a book called Jay Ballman's Full Color Guide to Marvel Silver Age Collectibles. That was put out in 2007. That's where it proves that the 1963 Ben Cooper Spider-Man costume was the first ever collectible. There's a really good picture and a write-up about the costume itself. So I need to pick that up. John owns one of the original 63 costumes. He has it. I don't know if he's got it graded, but it's in a really nice case to keep it protected. I've seen some pictures of him and his daughter where she's wearing the 50s costume, and I think she also wears the one from the 60s. He does a really good job of explaining the different versions of the costume itself. The first one in 63 was yellow and blue and red. It's a really weird design for Spider-Man because he's never had yellow. I think it was, who knows? Like, I don't know why they decided to use yellow other than their original design was yellow, but that's, a holy grail of collectibles, not only for people who collect Ben Cooper, but people who collect Marvel collectibles, and just overall, like, it's a very sought after costume because there's not that many of them. It has a copyright on the costume itself. It says 1963, and then the second version still says 1963 because it was just overstock. but um, the design's different. So I guess they did um, change something. I don't know how, if it's overstock, but that was kind of a Ben Cooper thing. They always used overstock from the year before to save money, but the actual technical second edition 1964 costume um, doesn't have the copyright in the lower right hand corner like the first one does. And then, the third one in 65 is also um, comes in both variations of the 63 and 64, the differences. But it has a 65 copyright in the lower right hand corner, and it came in three different combinations of cotton rayon, rayon cotton, or rayon vinyl. Um, and the weird thing is, a lot of times Ben Cooper didn't put a copyright on costumes because they didn't want to have to spend money on the ink. And I mean, it's one of those things I tell people all the time is, when companies, well, back then, not now, but when companies were producing this stuff, they weren't expecting people to collect it. It was just something that was supposed to be thrown away. That's my biggest, like, reason for wanting to collect Halloween stuff, is because it was not created to keep. It was created to use and throw away, or it was made out of the thinnest paper imaginable, so it wasn't made to last. And the fact that any of it exists is a miracle. And that's the same with these costumes. They were not made out of high quality materials. The fact that any of them exist is insane. Because not only I'm sure they would catch on fire before they had to be flame retardant, but they're very brittle. And I mean, if anyone has ever touched an old Ben Cooper costume, they're very fragile. The masks themselves are not they were not made to last 50, 60, 70 years. So the fact that these are still around is amazing. So kudos again, like I said, to John Cimino for tracking down this information and having the guts to put it out, because some people would have either just glossed over it or kept it to themselves or just thought nothing of it. But he put out a wonderful write-up. I'll share the link on the description of this podcast, and take a look at it and read. I kind of summarized a lot of what he talked about. I've tried to find as many articles as I could about this, and they're mostly just variations of what he originally wrote. So I figured, why not just stick with his version, because he's the one. He's always going to be tied to this story, and thankfully, he did it. I'm very excited to find out more. I will continue to keep looking for these costumes, and at the time of his publication of this story, which I said was 10 years ago, so the prices have changed tremendously since then. One of the 54 versions of the Spider-Man Ben Cooper was roughly 20 grand. The 58 version was around $500. The very first 63 Spider-Man was about $5,000, which I know it's way more than that now. So most of the other ones were a couple $100. If you found a box that was marked 63, it was around $1,000 just for the box. If you found the box and the first edition costume, that was around 10 grand. So all those prices I know have gone up tremendously, but this website is invaluable for me and for any collector that wants to know, how this came about. So thank you, John, for being so thorough and looking out for us as collectors and people who are just generally interested in the history of Halloween costumes and collectibles and in all things, that we love. So thanks to him. And as always, preserve Halloween.